Okay, I hope you enjoyed thinking about how privileged we are to be living under the new covenant. It's a wonderful thing. But that leaves us with an important question. If the Mosaic covenant needed to be superseded by this better covenant, well then what relevance do the laws of the Mosaic covenant have for us today, if any? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to understand why the law was given at all. And clearly God knew that Israel weren't going to keep it. We saw that. He knew that this covenant wouldn't be sufficient. So why give it? And what purpose does the law have in the unfolding story of the Bible? Well, we're going to see four purposes of the law in God's plan. But first of all, just so we're clear on what the purpose of the law wasn't, the purpose of the law was never to be a means of salvation. The New Testament leaves us in no doubt about that. Here's Paul preaching in Antioch. Let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man Jesus, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you, and by him everyone who believes is freed from everything which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. The law of Moses couldn't set people free from sin and death. Or look at the letter to the Galatians, one of the most important books of the Bible actually on understanding the law, written to Christians who were being led astray by false teachers who said that they still needed to keep the law. Is what Paul says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. Do you see his point? Why would Jesus have died if we could be justified simply by keeping the law? Or again, in chapter 3, if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. But, Paul's arguing there, it hasn't, and righteousness comes only through God's grace. And the law was, to use Doug Moo's phrase, a hypothetical covenant of works. In other words, it did promise life to the one who kept it, but because of our sinful hearts, no one could actually keep it. And so it was never intended to actually save. And what then was the point of it? Well, here are four main functions of the law in the Bible story, and these are things that we can still learn from studying it today. And firstly, it teaches us about what God is like. In giving the law, God says, "Be holy as I am holy." The laws reflect then something of the holy character of God. And that's something we're going to see over these next few chapters of Exodus together, as we look at the demands that God makes of how his people are to act, and we're going to see how those demands actually flow very naturally out of the way that God has acted in the first half of the book. And so the law reflects the goodness of God. And secondly, it teaches us that we need to be holy. And that's the other obvious implication of that same phrase, be holy as I am holy. And God demands holiness from us. A holy God cannot live in close relationship with sinners. And that explains a lot of the laws that sound rather strange to us today. And many of them were there either just to visibly demonstrate that Israel needed to be different to other nations, like the not eating shellfish law, or to help them get their heads around the concept of uncleanness, and that there is such a thing as being defiled in the eyes of God. We can't just casually waltz into his presence, and we need to be pure because God is holy. And that explains why many of the laws which functioned as visual aids are done away with under the new covenant. And the law shows us that God can't live with unclean, sinful people. We need to be holy. And if we're not holy, we need some kind of sacrifice to atone for our sin. Hence the whole sacrificial system. Thirdly then, the Lord shows us that we're not holy. We've seen in the history of Israel how hard they found it to keep the law. The New Testament really goes to town on making this point. Here's Paul at the start of Romans. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. And Paul saying there again that the law was never a viable route to justification. Rather, the point was that every mouth was stopped. And that is to stop us from proudly declaring that we are righteous by ourselves. And no, says Paul, through the law comes knowledge of sin. And that is to say, it shows us that we fall short of the righteousness that God requires. Similarly, Hebrews 10 says this about the sacrifices. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. And the huge number of animal sacrifices required was supposed to be a great visual reminder of how much sin needed to be atoned for. And the law reveals sin. More than that, we can actually say the law made sin worse. And that sounds quite counterintuitive, doesn't it? We might have imagined that the law was given to Israel to restrain sin. But actually, Paul says it did the opposite. Look at Romans 5. Now the law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Paul says that because the law made it even more explicit how Israel should live, it therefore made ignoring God's law an even more blatant rejection of him. Sin became trespass, an even worse kind of sin. Or look at Romans chapter 7. Here's what Paul says there. If it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law hadn't said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. See, Paul says there that the law, rather than restraining sin, actually provoked sin. And the idea there is that forbidden fruits taste the sweetest. And having sin defined for us perversely makes us more tempted by it. So then in lots of different ways, the law functions to highlight how big a problem sin is. And so fourthly, and most importantly, the law therefore shows us how much we need Jesus. And here's how Paul wonderfully continues in Romans chapter 3. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. The law, says Paul, doesn't make us righteous, but it does point forwards to the way we can be righteous through faith in Jesus. The law shows us that God is holy, and so we need to be holy, but we're not holy, all of which helps us to see that we need Jesus to make us holy. Now there's one more question that we need to briefly touch on before we make some conclusions about how we're going to apply the law today. And that is, to what extent do the laws of the Mosaic covenants continue into the New Testament? You may be aware, and that's quite a highly debated question in theology, and we're going to very quickly survey the two main evangelical views on this. And I hope by the end you'll see that actually, happily, in terms of application, they're really not very different. Really, I think this question of continuity comes down to the question, what does it mean that the law is now fulfilled? And now everyone would agree that to some extent the law has been brought to an end by Jesus' coming. So everyone agrees that physical sacrifices have been brought to an end, and they were a shadow of the real once-for-all sacrifice that Jesus made, and so we don't need them as a visual aid anymore. Neither do we need the food laws, so they're gone too. Jesus, there in Mark's Gospel, declares all foods now clean, which is amazing news because I find it hard to imagine not being able to eat bacon. Also gone are the various festivals. Paul tells us that in Colossians chapter 2. Again, they were a shadow of what was to come in Jesus. Now he's come, we don't need them anymore. So everyone agrees on those things. But then here's where things get a little bit more controversial. What about these kind of statements about the law? How about Ephesians chapter 2? For he, that is Jesus himself, is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. How about Romans chapter 10? For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. How about this in Hebrews 8? In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Here's where the debate comes then. To what extent has the law been abolished and made obsolete? Now, here are the two main camps, which trace their origins back to two of the great reformers. The so-called Reformed view reflects John Calvin's position. And the Reformed view would say that what's being referred to in those kind of verses as being brought to an end is the power of the law to accuse, and because we're righteous in Christ, and also the civil and ceremonial aspects of the law. And so the Reformed position argues that the law can be divided up into these three categories. Some laws are civil, about how Israel should be governed and what kind of punishments there should be when people sin. Those laws are done away with. There are also ceremonial laws like sacrifices and offerings. They're done away with. But then there are also moral laws. And the Reformed position says those laws continue and we should still keep them as Christians. The other mainstream view is called the modified Lutheran view, which is more along the lines of Martin Luther's position. And people who hold this view say, actually, we should really think of the whole law much more as an integrated whole, which has come to an end. And so we shouldn't primarily look to the law to be a guide to the conduct of Christians today. The argument is that while the law certainly has moral aspects to it, which we will see reappear in the New Testament, the law can't be neatly divided into moral, civil and ceremonial categories. Distinctions aren't made clear. And so they would argue that the language of the New Testament is more comprehensive and unnuanced about the era of the Mosaic law having come to an end. Instead, they would argue that the laws of the Mosaic covenant have been replaced now with the law of Christ. And now that's a phrase that's used a couple of times in Paul's writing, and one of the key texts in the modified Lutheran position is 1 Corinthians 9. Paul says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law." And so Paul's describing there how he adapts his lifestyle towards different groups of people, so as not to cause any unnecessary offence, so he can preach the gospel more easily. So when he's with Jews, he lives like a Jew, observing the law, but when he's with Gentiles, he doesn't. But here's the thing he clarifies about that in verse 21. Does that mean he's completely lawless? Does he live a life without following any commandments when he's amongst the Gentiles? Well, no, he says. I'm not outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. What's the law of Christ? Well, modified Lutherans would say that is the example and teaching of Jesus, found in the Gospels and expounded by the Apostles. And that's the law that Christians now live by. So what does it mean for the law to be fulfilled? Well, it means that Jesus has brought it to an end as something to be done by us, but still the law in many ways pointed towards the kind of standards of behaviour in the kingdom of heaven that Jesus exemplified and taught us to follow. And so, for example, it's not surprising that 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in Jesus' teaching. Now, why do I say they're not very different, those two positions in the end? Well, can you see, both of those positions say that in some sense God has moral standards for us that are the same in both the Mosaic Law and in the New Testament. And what they mainly disagree on is how we go about identifying what those moral standards are. So the Reformed view would say the moral laws are those that haven't been clearly overturned in the New Testament. And so a primary way that we should apply the law is looking for principles for how we should live as Christians today. The more Lutheran view would want to be more cautious. They'd say, actually, rather, it's only the laws that we see specifically restated by Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament that Christians should follow. And really, the New Testament is the primary place we should look if we're wanting to find commands for us today. Now, the encouraging thing is, actually, at the end of the day, in practice, you'll find there is almost no difference between those two views in terms of actual practical application. And they generally arrive at the same applications, just from two slightly different directions. It does make a little bit of difference in terms of what we think we're supposed to primarily get out of the Old Testament law as we study through it. And so this is the point where I need to show my hand a little bit as we think about how we apply the law in light of everything we've been discussing. I'm going to suggest 4 questions that I think we ought to think about as we study parts of the law over the next few weeks. 3 of which I think are uncontroversial, and one of which I think depends a little bit on which of those 2 views you take. So question 1, what does this teach us about God? And that's uncontroversial. Everyone agrees that the law reflects God's holiness. So that's a really good place to start. Question 2, how does this show us how difficult holiness is? Again, uncontroversial. To be holy as God is holy is difficult for sinners, and the law shows us that. Question number 3, how does this anticipate the law of Christ by giving us a general sense of what loving God and loving neighbour means? And this is the slightly controversial one. You might have noticed the language of law of Christ indicates a modified Lutheran position. And that's my own view. I think the modified Lutheran position best fits the way the New Testament speaks about the law. But look, I'm certainly not going to fall out with anyone who takes a Reformed view. If you are more persuaded by the Reformed view, actually this is the question you'd probably want to ask instead of that. What principles can I draw from these laws about how I should live to please God? And you probably want to make that question a bit of a bigger focus of your application if you take that position. But can you see, actually, there's really not very much difference there, is there? The Lutheran view just wants to be a little bit more cautious about finding specific applications and specific kind of principles. And then finally, question 4, again uncontroversial, this one. How do we see Jesus keep the law perfectly and be the substance of what it foreshadowed? Jesus lived under this law, he obeyed perfectly, and he became the perfect sacrifice that we needed. And so inasmuch as we saw in our first all-church study that the whole of the Old Testament was God speaking to us about Jesus, that, I would argue, is the primary question we want to ask when we study the law. So the Old Testament points us to Jesus through books we've seen, through pictures and patterns, and also through laws. One other way it points to Jesus, very much related to laws, is through promises. And so that's what I'm going to leave you now to think about in your last few minutes together.